The Neoliberal Podcast is part of the Neoliberal Project and made possible by our members and supporters. If you enjoy the podcast and want to become a member of the project, head to neoliberalproject.org/join. You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/neoliberalproject. These members and patrons help cover the podcast's expenses and make it all happen. Thanks for your support and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and today we're starting a new series on the Neoliberal Podcast examining effective altruism. What is effective altruism? Well, it's a movement that says you should try to do good, and that you should think very, very hard about the particular way you can do the most good. And that leads to some very interesting causes that people support that are not always the typical causes that you think of when you think of doing good in the world, when you think of charity. We're going to be examining them, and the first cause area that we're looking at is animal welfare. Joining me today is Lewis Bollard. Lewis is a senior program officer working on farm animal welfare at Open Philanthropy, who advocates for animal welfare projects as one of the most cost-effective ways to do good in the world, and that's the topic of today's episode. So, Lewis, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeremiah. It's great to be on the podcast.
Very excited to have you, and I'm very excited to kick off this series. And so, I guess let's start for an audience that is not super well-versed in effective altruism and kind of this insular world that exists. At a very introductory level, why should people care about animal welfare?
Good question. I think we all ultimately do already care about animal welfare. I think most of us either have pets or appreciate wildlife, love animals in some way. Every US state has felony law protecting against animal cruelty, recognizing our social view that abuse of animals is wrong. I think where we're really trying to extend that is to ensure that the same ethic applies to all animals, and particularly animals consumed for food. And as for why we should care for them, I think it's the same reason we should care for a dog or a cat, that when things are done to harm those animals, that offends our collective ethics. I think that's equally true if harm is done to a pig or a chicken. And then, of course, the numbers of farm animals being mistreated on factory farms are massive. In the US, we're talking about 2.5 billion farm animals alive at any point in time. So I think we have that huge scale of an amount of pervasive abuse that really deserves our attention.
So you're kind of making the case for ethical, moral intuitionism here, that just you can kind of already tell we care for animals because anybody who sees like a dog in the street getting kicked by a person just kind of intuitively thinks that's awful, right? And
that's right.
So there's kind of this case, like, whether you want to acknowledge this or not, it's like built into being part of human.
That's right. And we could obviously explore where those intuitions come from, but I think they're rooted pretty deeply in most of us. And I think most of us wouldn't want to live in a world where we repealed all the animal cruelty laws that currently exist. We wouldn't want to live in a world where anyone could abuse an animal however they wished. I think most of us recognize there's something fundamentally wrong about that. And so I think a lot of the work of farm animal welfare is really just extending that intuition that already exists.
I think the next logical question to ask then is exactly what kind of moral weight do we put on animals? If we agree that this is a non-zero number and that most people kind of intuitively know animal cruelty is bad and animals, we should care about them at least a little bit, then the next question becomes, well, how much should we care about them? Do we care about animals as much as humans, or are there some animals that we care about more than others?
Yeah, those are some great philosophical questions, and I think they're hard ones for each of us to answer. But I'm not sure we need to pin down our exact moral weights for each species to work out that there's something wrong with factory farming, and particularly the scale in which we're doing it. I think if you think that animals matter even a little bit, even a tiny bit, the sheer scale of factory farming makes that abuse seem really unacceptable. I think, too, that we already as a society recognize that abuse of animals matters more than a little bit. We've made this a felony crime in every state. There are jail sentences attached to it. And really, if you just applied a similar amount of concern to a pig, for instance, as the law currently applies to dogs, that would quickly make all of the current practices of factory farming, I think, unacceptable in most people's eyes.
So let's talk about factory farming. So I want to get into some of the very, very gross and awful details in just a second. But I think first we should do a little bit of description of why this is exactly the area that we care about. Because frankly, so much animal charity seems to not be focused on farm animals. It seems to be focused on dogs and cats and other things that we find very cute. And it seems to be focused on perhaps things like animal rehabilitation or, saving animal species in the wild. And it's just farm animals seem to be something that we don't talk about quite as much. So why do you focus on factory farming?
Yeah, that's right. I think those animal issues we do focus on are all really important, and I'm glad there are people working on them. But something unique that effective altruism brings is a framework for thinking about the issues on which you can have the greatest impact. And effective altruists often look to 3 criteria to see whether issues make sense to focus on. One is the scale of the problem, how many individuals are involved. Another is the tractability, how much of a difference you can make on that area. And the third is the neglect, which is to say that if other people aren't paying attention to the issue, that's actually a good reason for us to focus on it. And farm animals look really important and appealing across all 3 criteria. There are about 2.5 billion farm animals alive at any point in time in the US, about 30 billion globally, and treated in ways that, as you mentioned, we may get into some of the details, but I think people already have a sense that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way most of those animals are being treated. On the tractability side, we see the potential to significantly improve the well-being of large numbers of animals, and we can get into some of the details of that. Then on the neglect side, the whole world of farm animal welfare and advocacy for farm animals has a smaller budget than some of the individual groups focusing on other issues. So the ASPCA, for instance, has a larger budget than all the money in the world devoted toward helping farm animals. And so part of what we're calling for here is a slight rebalancing of that and paying more attention to the most neglected animals.
So let's talk specifically about some of the most farmed animals, because, if you're like me or like other people, you do eat meat, and most of the meat that you probably eat is probably raised in factory farms. And I think it's worthwhile to get into specific animals. Probably the 3 big ones I can think of, or maybe 4 big ones, are chicken, beef, pigs or pork, and then maybe fish as well. And I think it would be instructive for people who are not aware potentially of the conditions in some of these places. What is it like? Like, what are we actually struggling against when we are trying to reform practices, say, for chicken or for cows or for what have you?
Yeah, great question. And I'd encourage listeners to go online and look for themselves as well. I think it's often easier to just watch videos or see photos and rather than to sort of believe someone else's descriptions. But, I have visited all of these kinds of farms. And so I've seen for myself the common practices. And I can tell you first, when it comes to chickens, there are 2 different industries there. So there's the egg-laying industry, where they keep hens in battery cages, which are effectively immobilizing cages about the size of a microwave. They put 5 or 6 birds into each of them. And that's where they spend their whole life. They spend 2 years there, barely able to move, not able to do anything that a chicken wants to do. We've turned them into widgets. Similarly on the meat chicken side.
I don't want to
please.
I don't want to like gloss over that too quickly. So a chicken would essentially spend its entire life in this battery cage scenario inside of an enclosure that is the size of the interior of a microwave.
That's right. And it's surreal when you think about sort of putting an animal in a space where it can't even extend its wings. I mean, let alone flap its wings or move around. It's really, and it's a very surreal, sad sight seeing animals kept in this kind of confinement for the course of years. for everything we know about these animals, it feels relatively similar to how it would feel if you or I were trapped in an elevator with a whole bunch of people for the indefinite future.
And then you were about to make a point about, I think, about not the egg-laying chickens, but the chickens raised for their meat.
That's right. So meat-producing chickens have a whole different welfare issue. They're not kept in cages, but their bodies effectively become their cages because they're bred to grow so fast and in such a lopsided way to generate the breast meat that is prized by the industry, that these birds are effectively falling apart by the time they go to slaughter, which is only at 48 days of age. And so what we see there is really these genetic problems that leave birds unable to walk, leave them with burns and blisters across their bodies, leave them in chronic pain such that in experiments, these chickens will choose to feed on painkiller-laced food in a sign of just the fact that they're in constant pain.
Now, there's fully other things we could get into. We could get into chickens being debeaked, their beaks essentially being cut off. But in the interest of kind of moving on to another one, chickens are also the thing that I hear when I read about this and I listen to things about this. I hear of chickens normally as like one of the morally worst cases, and we can get into some of the reasons why. But I also hear about pork production as one of the most, kind of morally repugnant things that happens in factory farms. And I guess, number one, could you describe what's going on with pork production? And number two, would you agree with like that as far as chickens and pork are some of the most outright repugnant things?
That's right. I think chickens and pigs have suffered by being robust animals who will stay alive in even really abysmal conditions. And the industry has taken advantage of that to impose some of the worst conditions we see across all of the animal industries. So for pigs, the problems start when they're born. The male pigs are castrated without any pain relief. They also typically have their teeth cut, their tails cut. One of the most sort of heart-wrenching abuses we see is with the mother pigs, the ones who are producing the piglets who will ultimately be raised and go to slaughter. And these sows, when they're pregnant, they're kept in something called gestation crates, which immobilize their body. I mean, the gestation crate is the size of a coffin, and the sow literally can't turn around in it. And she spends all of her time in that crate, except for when she's moved to another crate, the farrowing crate, which is where she gives birth. She also can't turn around in that crate. And then she goes back to another gestation crate, and she does this for 3 years. And that's the standard across the industry, and absolutely defended by the industry as what they view as an appropriate way to keep an animal.
There's two more animals I want to cover because I think they are kind of the big animals in terms of consumption in the U.S. And it may not be the case globally, but I'd also like to talk about cows and about fish because that seems to me to be the big four, unless I've missed something that some other big category of meat. Can you talk about the conditions for cows and fish?
Sure, yeah. So cows is actually a really mixed case. Beef cattle actually have it about as good as any farm animal does. They're typically kept out on the range on ranches, and although they do have some mutilations done to their body, they might be branded, they might be castrated, they're otherwise not really interfered with. And I think they probably live a pretty okay life until their final month, when they're normally brought into feedlots, which are a more confining environment.
So there's a lot of cases, not for every cow, but for some cows, it's the case that by and large they get to live an okay cow life. Walk up some hills, eat some grass. And not to say
right.
that everything's perfect, but
sure,
it's
exactly.
It's not
that's my best sense. I mean, we obviously we don't know what it feels like to be a cow, but my sense is they have most of what a cow probably wants for most of their life. And, they are certainly more vulnerable to heat waves, to bad weather, but they have far more freedom and behavioral freedom than any other animal has. And then when it comes to dairy cows, there's a mixture of systems. Some systems allow the cows to go outside. A lot of them, unfortunately, don't. And dairy cows have their own physical ailments, which come about from the way that we've bred them to produce far more milk than they used to, actually about 4 times more milk per cow than they did before we started this genetic selection process. And unfortunately, that leads to a huge percentage of these cows having constant mastitis in their udders, and so that's a very painful ailment to have. But again, they probably have a little more behavioral freedom than when we think about pigs and chickens, and there are certainly fewer of them.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about how the laws of economics are kind of pushing up against the laws of genetics and evolution. And, in some instances, that's actually worked out great in that, like, humans are now taller than we used to be, and we're healthier and we live longer. And it's a mixture of, evolutionary impacts with economic impacts, and it probably has been for the good. But when you think about what we're able to do with farm animals, that, we can just use the economic incentives and genetics drive us to produce this cow that makes 10 times as much milk. He said 4 times, but we'll get to if it's possible, we'll get to 10 times. Just watch us. And that's both awe-inspiring in a way, in like the old-time sense of awe, like the biblical sense of awe, where it almost means like fear and terror. I don't know. I find myself feeling very conflicted about our ability to change things, and then whether or not that's a good thing sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I think the 20th century was in many ways a time of record progress for humanity. Unfortunately, it was a time of record harm to farm animals, and particularly as we gained the technological ability to keep animals alive in really unnatural and unappealing conditions. We've been able to separate that. There used to be a natural linkage that, animals would only stay alive if they were treated okay. Once we poured drugs into the mix, once we poured all kinds of artificial systems into the mix, we're able to decouple that. And so we're able to keep animals alive even though they're miserable. And unfortunately, there's not a big economic incentive to help animals to thrive or to live really good lives. It's really, you just want to keep them alive until slaughter.
And then I think the last of the big culinary options is fish. It seems to me likely that there's going to be a different argument for farmed fish and for fish caught in the wild. But, if that's not correct, you can tell me. But what are the conditions like with the fish that we eat that end up on our plate?
That's right. And there's actually huge variation amongst fish, not just between wild and farmed fish, but between different species. We now farm over 400 different species of fish. But when it comes to the life of a farmed fish, it's normally in a large pond, potentially in an ocean net if it's something like a salmon, or increasingly in indoor systems in tanks, which very closely resemble factory farms for land animals. And, we don't know much about the life of fish and the desires of fish and what they need and want to flourish. But you do see that in the fish farming industry, very high rates of mortality, very high rates of physical damage to the fish, suggesting that we have not worked out how to raise these animals humanely. And then when it comes to wild caught fish, obviously there's no major human interference until they're caught. Unfortunately, when they are caught, there's really no regard to their welfare. So where for at least most land animals, there's an expectation of humane slaughter, there's no expectation of that with fish. And so the most common methods of catching fish, trawling for them, essentially they're just crowded into a net, and then dragged for hours, sometimes even days, while they're slowly suffocating, slowly being crushed. And then when they're brought onto the boat, if they're still alive, they're normally just allowed to suffocate, which again can take hours. And so I think that one of the biggest things we see with fish is just this complete inability to even kill them in a quick or humane manner.
Now, the fish brings up an interesting point for me, because it goes back to kind of the moral intuitionism, I guess. But when I just think about this, just intuitively, it seems to me very obvious that we should care about like mammals, which I think have a higher degree of intelligence than most other animals. And there's exceptions, sure, but mammals on average are going to have higher intelligence. And then, maybe a little bit less so for chickens, but enough that you don't want to torture them. But then for fish, it kind of falls apart. And I've tried to read a little bit about this, but at least for me, the arguments that fish are fully conscious beings or have the same kind of consciousness that even a cow would have, it seems a lot more dubious. So how do you think about this when you have to determine like which creatures are worthy of our moral concern?
Yeah, it's a tough question. And to be honest, we still have a lot of uncertainty about what other animals feel, which animals are sentient, and even what it means to be sentient. But I do think that the weight of the evidence is increasingly on the side of fish being sentient and of them feeling similar kinds of emotions, at least the basic ones like pain and fear, as we do. There was a researcher, the late Victoria Braithwaite, who devoted her career to trying to work out whether fish feel pain. And her emphatic answer was yes. I mean, she designed a bunch of really clever experiments where she would get fish to make trade-offs. She would see how they reacted to different kinds of pain, how they would react to pain relief then given to them. And they reacted in much the same way as other animals would. And there are evolutionary reasons to think that would make sense, given the evolutionary basis of a lot of pain and fear is that an animal that can move, that can act, that can determine its behavior, has this as a stimulus and as a reason to stay away from harm in future. So I do think there's a lot of reason to worry that fish suffer. Now, it's a harder question of how you weigh the suffering of a fish against the suffering of another animal. But I think, again, just because of the sheer scale, I think that at least argues for paying some attention to the well-being of fish.
Yeah, one of my things that I always run into when I think about this is just that I worry that the words we're using are too broad, like consciousness and suffering and sentience and things like that. And there's almost a definitional thing here where if you're using the same word, consciousness or sentience, for instance, to refer to both humanity and to fish, I almost feel like at that point the word has lost its meaning. If it's describing two things as different, in my view, as the experience of being a human mind and being a thinking, feeling, reasoning body and you know, somebody who can make a rocket ship, as opposed to like, I don't know, a shrimp. Or, you know, I guess a shrimp is probably even a more extreme case, but let's say a salmon or something like that. Like it's kind of that old argument, like, you know, if you say taxation is theft, okay, you can say that, but well, then taxation is just then the good kind of theft. You know, some kinds of theft will be good if you insist that taxes are theft. At some point, I'm almost like, well, if we insist that like fish are conscious, I almost wonder if some forms of consciousness don't matter in that case.
Sure. Yeah, I think these are tough questions. I think where I come down on them is that although I certainly agree it's important that humans can make rocket ships and make moral judgments and do other things that a lot of other species can't do, I do think that ultimately sentience is a really valid basis for moral concern. And, I think you can take it back as far as someone like Jeremy Bentham, who had his famous line that the question's not can they talk, nor can they reason, but can they suffer? And I think for a lot of us, that's intuitive, when we look at children, when we look at people who don't have the ability to make complex moral judgments for whatever reason, we still normally think that their suffering matters and that they should be accorded moral concern. And so I certainly don't expect people to think that a fish should matter equally to a human. But I do think that perhaps part of the challenge of us taking seriously the well-being and the sentience of other animals is a bit of our sort of inbuilt human bias, where we look at a fish and it has scales and it has beady little eyes and it doesn't really in any way resemble us. And I think it's very hard for us in that circumstance to relate to it or extend moral compassion to it. But I do think that throughout history, a lot of the moral progress we've achieved has been achieved by expanding our moral circle and applying empathy and moral consideration to beings who don't seem like us. And to me, that generally seems like the right direction for us to go in and at least something that we should take very seriously and consider.
One of the things that I'd love to ask is about people's dietary choices, because one of the foremost ways that you see kind of animal welfare evangelism being done is by people advocating that you go vegan or that you go vegetarian or that you eat less meat in general. And obviously, this is just one form. It may or may not be the most effective form of outreach or the best way to spend your charity dollars, and we can talk about that. But because it is such a common way, I want to ask you about it just very briefly. For people who are considering this, obviously if someone hears all the horrible conditions and they look it up and they decide to go full vegan, that's a win. But for people who are considering maybe just, well, I should probably eat a little bit less meat, are there particular strategies that you would encourage them to use? And I'll put myself in as an example. I am not a vegan. I'm not a vegetarian, but I am trying to eat less meat because I think a lot of these arguments have weight. And one of the things that I've tried to do is basically stop eating chicken. I don't think I've eaten chicken for the last month or two, maybe. It hasn't been very long, but that's been my strategy. Do you think it's a decent strategy to just at least start with chicken and maybe expand from there? Is there other advice you'd give?
Yeah, I think that's a great strategy. I mean, I think, as you mentioned earlier, chickens really have it the worst of any animals and on the larger scale. And so I think just stopping eating chicken and potentially eggs probably have the largest welfare impact of any move people could make. Stopping eating fish, if you give them moral consideration, I think can also be a really good move. Of course, people can also choose higher welfare meats, places like Whole Foods. They tend to be more expensive, so I think it typically makes sense to couple that with eating less of it. And then, as you say, some people will choose to go vegetarian or vegan or part-time vegan. I think, as with all these things, it's a continuum of options. And I do think that you get the most immediate bang for your buck by cutting out chicken.
One more kind of mainstream question, and then we're going to get into the deeply nerdy stuff that I know EAs love to talk about. But one question I always have is, do you see, as someone who I believe you're vegan yourself, right?
That's right.
And I know there's a lot of effective altruists who are. Do you see any version of ethical meat consumption? And I see things like this as sometimes I hear people talk about oysters or mussels or just shellfish in general, that there's a lot of shellfish that don't even have nervous systems. So the moral concern there seems pretty blank. I also sometimes hear about how the most ethical way to eat meat is actually just to hunt for it yourself. And that's so much better than factory farming. Do you have any views about, just in general, are there certain species that are more okay to eat or more ethical, or as a vegan, would you kind of draw a hard line and say no?
Yeah, it's a great question. And people are going to reach different opinions on this depending on other considerations they have. So, I think from a pure animal welfare point of view, oysters are probably totally fine. I think it's extremely unlikely that they're conscious. Hunting is probably better than factory farming, so long as someone is a good shot and, shooting, not using a bow and arrow or something. And then I think that as we just discussed, that eliminating things like chicken, eggs, fish tend to be the worst. Now, it's of course true that beef and dairy are worse from a climate perspective. And so people who are weighing climate perspective may want to reduce both of those things. But I do think in general that it's about working out what's achievable for you. For me, being vegan is relatively easy. I know it doesn't feel that way for everyone. And I do think there's a lot of harm you can reduce just by reducing the amount of animals in your diet and by being a bit more careful about where they come from.
All right. So one of the ways that you said you evaluate potential opportunities is, number one, how important is it? And we've talked a little bit about that. We've talked about the scale of the problem here when it comes to factory farming. But you also talk about areas that are neglected, that nobody's paying attention to them, nobody's funding them, and areas that are tractable in terms of it's easy to make a difference. So with all that in mind, what are some of the ways that open philanthropy is looking at animal welfare right now that have the biggest impact? Because that is kind of the selling point of EA, of effective altruism, is we very seriously study how can we do the most good with this money that we have. If we've got X amount of dollars that our community is going to spend on charity every year, we take very seriously how much good can we do with that? What's the highest amount of good? So what are you guys thinking about right now in terms of that? What is your research showing you?
Yeah, a couple of areas that I think have been really exciting in terms of the progress that we've been able to achieve, or that advocates have been able to achieve so far for farm animals. So one of those areas is around corporate campaigns, campaigning to get large food companies to take responsibility for the welfare of animals in their supply chain. This is partly a response to the failure of government regulation, that there are almost no laws protecting animals on farms in America. And so you have to turn to companies like a Walmart that has the scale of a state actor and is responsible for a huge number of animals in their supply chain. And so a couple of things that advocates have been working on with companies. One is getting commitments to going cage-free. The vast majority of American food companies have now made such commitments, and we've already seen about 100 million animals out of cages since these corporate wins were first secured. And over time, we think we'll see hundreds of millions more animals out of cages. Another area has been getting rid of gestation crates for pregnant sows. And then another area has been improving conditions for the meat chickens, particularly around the genetic problems we discussed.
So when you talk about these corporate kind of campaigns, what exactly does that mean that you do a corporate campaign to try to get, let's try to get Walmart to only sell chicken that's not in the battery cages, those tiny cages? Either it's I think with chickens they can either be in a more open space that's still kind of crowded, but at least they have room to wander around, or they can just be free range. But how does that actually work in practice? What do they do to get someone like Walmart or someone like a big food service operator to actually switch?
Right. So it's not that different from lobbying government. And in many ways, I think there are increasingly similar expectations of businesses as of government, particularly where government has failed to regulate. So typically advocates will go to these companies, and the first thing they'll point out is that these companies are sitting on a major PR liability, which is that if most consumers of those companies knew where their products came from, if they knew how the animals were treated to make eggs for Walmart, they'd generally be repulsed. They'd be disgusted. And I think, we see this with surveys, that people have an expectation that animals in these corporate supply chains are being treated far better than they are. And so these companies are sitting on a liability. And sometimes just raising that issues with companies is enough. Sometimes it requires a public campaign. Sometimes it requires pressure. But the core of it is always trying to align more closely what consumers' expectations already are with the reality of how animals are treated in those companies' supply chains.
Is this essentially a case of we go to the company and we say, look, your animals are being treated horribly this way. Maybe you're aware, maybe you're not aware, but that's what you're selling. It sure would be bad if we were to raise, a year-long campaign pointing out how you torture chickens. Why don't you change this? Is that it's essentially, I don't want to use the word blackmail, but it's the the legal form of following through on a threat to sully someone's reputation in a way that is basically blackmail but not illegal. I mean, again, blackmail has the wrong connotation, but it's essentially, we'd hate to tarnish your reputation. Why don't you just change it without us doing that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, sure, that could be a component. I mean, I think for a lot of companies, they themselves have no idea how the animals in their supply chain are treated, and so sometimes it is just a case of going to companies and saying, hey, were you aware of this? And I think in the same way that companies often have no idea how foreign subsidiaries are involved in corrupting foreign governments or how they might be complicit in human rights abuses, a lot of it is about making the company and its key stakeholders aware of that. And so oftentimes senior management, the staff of the company, the board of the company might themselves be repulsed to see how animals are being treated in their supply chain. But certainly there is also the background threat, I guess, that consumers of that company will be themselves repulsed by that, and that the more they learn about it, that will really turn them away from the brand. And so, yeah, I do think that for corporate campaigns, it is a lot about saying, hey, why not get ahead of this issue? Why not do the right thing here? This is ultimately something that it's going to be cheaper in the long run to do the right thing.
Okay, so now we're back to redeeming the profit incentive, is what I'm hearing.
That's right.
I mean, it cuts both ways, but it's an interesting thing because this is something I've heard, and maybe you can verify this story for me, but I've heard that animal welfare is one of the areas where at some point, maybe, I don't know, between 5 and 10 years ago, there was a real like switcheroo in how people thought about this issue, that they used to be focused one way and they had to admit that it wasn't working and switch entirely to this focus on kind of a political corporate strategy.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think our movement used to focus overly on individual consumer behavior, trying to get individuals to go vegan or eat less meat. And as we discussed, I think that can be a great thing for people individually to do. But unfortunately, it's never going to achieve the scale of change needed. And given the scale is so large, I mean, given, we're considering over 7 animals kept in factory farms for every American alive, I don't think we're going to get most Americans to go vegan or eat a lot less meat. And so a lot of the interventions that we now focus on are focused on corporate work, legislative work, or technology and meat alternatives that can make it easier to substitute more humane products.
Other than this kind of corporate campaign, what other things has Open Phil funded in the last few years that you think have a particularly good record for being effective ways to help animals, other than this kind of let's pressure a company to change their ways, and we've got a lot of ways to do that? But what else are you guys doing?
Yeah, so another avenue has been legislative change. And I mentioned that it's very hard to secure legislative change in the US due to the power of the meat industry lobby. But we have seen a number of states pass laws. California passed Proposition 12 with overwhelming voter support to ban cages and crates and the sale of eggs and pork from cages and crates. And then we've seen 7 other states follow suit in recent years. And then across the Atlantic in Europe, we're seeing a major overhaul of farm animal welfare legislation underway. And I think the potential really for Europe to have world-leading standards soon. And then we're seeing tentative legislative changes in other parts of the world too, like India, China, and other countries where farm animal welfare is still in its infancy.
Yeah, it's funny, one of the distinguishing features of effective altruism, at least in its kind of earliest days, was a really heavy focus on donating your money outside of the rich world. This is something that I still talk about all the time, and that, it's something like the US donates something like $500 billion a year. And that's just the United States. It's not counting Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Western Europe, all the other rich parts of the world. $500 billion. It's an enormous number. But the vast, vast majority of it, over 90%, is domestic. It's donated within the United States. Whereas, the effective altruist response to that is typically most of that money could be doing much more good in other parts of the world that are very, very poor. It's just easier to make a difference there because there's so few resources. And that makes me think about this area as well. And, you mentioned, obviously, you guys are trying to donate in China and in other places potentially. How do you think about that aspect of it where, I guess animals aren't any poorer or richer in any part of the world. They're just farm animals everywhere. Are they treated worse in other places? Are there more of them in other places? Like, how do you conceptualize the scale of this problem in America versus other places?
Yeah, as you say, I mean, animals have similar interests and similar experiences regardless of where they are in the world. And unfortunately, the factory farm model, although it began in America, is now being exported almost everywhere. So we see the same battery cages, literally the same cages. They'll be made by American firms and then shipped around the world. We see even the same genetic problems with meat chickens because there's a duopoly, a global duopoly of companies that control over 90% of the genetic stock of chickens all around the world. And so a lot of the welfare problems that we see in America, although we didn't see them in other countries a couple of decades ago, they're now pervasive, and it's now true almost globally. So as a result, the majority of our funding is globally focused. It's outside the US because that's where the majority of animals are. Although it is worth noting, you mentioned that animals are no poorer or richer, but it's certainly true that richer people eat more animals. And so we do see in Europe, in the US, in the richest parts of Asia, far higher rates of animal product consumption than we see in poorer countries. And certainly one of the big trends has been that as emerging markets become wealthier, they're eating far more animals. And that's driving a rapid increase in factory farming globally.
I just had a really like morally repugnant argument in my head that we should keep everybody impoverished because it would mean less total suffering in the world. But I don't think I'm ready.
Yeah,
I don't think I'm ready to accept that, because so much of like what I focus on is, how do we make everyone in the world wealthy and
absolutely
prosperous and,
Yeah, and that's very much not our approach either. I mean, I think for one thing, people who are in poorer countries are still consuming very few animals. So if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, the rates of meat consumption are still incredibly low compared to rich Western countries. For another thing, I think that we see a sort of curve, as we see on a lot of issues, where as countries grow richer, yes, they consume more animals. But as they get even richer, they tend to move toward greater farm animal welfare regulation and perhaps greater consumption of meat alternatives. And so I think that, certainly I don't think the answer is to keep the world poor. I think the answer is that as the world continues to become richer, which will be great for humans, that we make sure that we essentially direct some of that wealth to helping animals and direct some of it to better conditions for animals, to better research on meat alternatives, and all kinds of things that could relatively cheaply solve so many of these problems that we're describing.
I'm really glad you brought up meat alternatives, because I wanted to go there in terms of, do you see this, I guess, number one, how do you see progress as it currently exists with fake meat, impossible burgers, things like that, and with lab-grown meat and just that entire field? And do you think it's something that effective altruists should focus on, or is it good but not as effective as other areas? Like, how do you think about this?
Yeah, I think it's a really promising space with a lot of potential. I think we're still really in the early days, and people who are following this closely have probably seen the sort of ups and downs of Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods and other plant-based meat companies. But there's been huge progress from where we were 5 years ago. I mean, I remember that meat alternatives used to be these kind of tasteless bean burgers, and now we have burgers that almost there with real meat. Now they're not there quite yet, and they're certainly not there on price. And so
it's funny. I think they're pretty damn close. I mean, as someone who enjoys beef and who enjoys hamburgers, I mean, the way I always tell people is, if you were just eating a patty, like a hamburger patty by itself, you could probably tell the difference, but it's not a big difference. But if you've got like a hamburger with like cheese and lettuce and tomato and ketchup on it, there's no way you can tell the difference. I'm convinced you can't.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, so much of the meat we consume is consumed in forms where you're barely tasting the meat. So, I think, for instance, Impossible has these new chicken nuggets, and I'm sure that if someone sort of separated out the contents, they could notice a slight difference in texture from traditional chicken nuggets. But the chicken nuggets, I don't think there's anything particularly special about the meat coming from the chickens and the distinctive taste that has. And so I think that, they're incredibly close replicas.
I mean, it's true. It's not any grosser than the pink goo they're made from right now.
Right. Yeah, and that's that's certainly the irony. You see increasingly some of these plant-based meat products being attacked as unnatural or otherwise sort of technological products that can't possibly be healthy. And of course, the irony is, even if we thought what was natural is good inherently, that there's nothing even remotely natural about the way we produce meat these days.
Do you think it's something that EAs should be trying to fund, new startups to tackle this area in new areas, or to tackle this in new areas? Like, obviously we've got beef seems pretty well developed. There's the Possible Burgers, there's Beyond Meat. We've got some of that, but like people tackling fake fish or other things. Do you think that this is a good cause area, or is it really good that it's happening, but it's not something you would recommend?
I think it's a great cause area. I think I would encourage folks to focus more on the nonprofit side. So supporting groups like the Good Food Institute, working to seek federal funding of research on alternative proteins in the same way that we saw for alternative energy sources. I think there's maybe more to be done there, and it's certainly going to be more neglected than on the company side, on the startup side. I mean, it's very exciting to see all the startups and the investment going in. For now, the market seems to be taking care of that a bit itself. And so where I think more altruistically people can be focused is on doing what the market's not going to do in this space.
One thing that I'd love to talk about, and that I've seen that you've mentioned before in previous interviews, is the funding of documentaries and exposés. The reason I think this is interesting is that it gets at a much more fundamental level of change than most effective altruism does. Most effective altruists, when they do whatever project they're doing, it's with a very, very specific kind of action-reaction sequence. I buy bed nets and I give them to a person in Africa and they don't get malaria. Or I go to this company, I tell them to stop using battery cages, I pressure them, and then they, stop using battery cages. Bioweapons and all these other areas that people do. Again, typically we're talking about very action has a direct consequence. But when we talk about funding kind of documentaries and exposés and how important those are for animal welfare, we're talking about a much more fundamental level of change. We're talking about I think I looked up something where 30% of vegetarians or something like that said that they became a vegetarian after watching a TV show or a documentary or a YouTube video about factory farm exposed kind of thing. And that obviously has a pretty large impact if you can convert a percentage of people to vegetarianism, but also just it enables everything else you do. When a company is worried about, if they're going to start a campaign against me because I use battery cages or because I use these gestation cages for a pig, what they're really worried about is that people care about animals enough and they're going to be outraged by this. But in order to build that sense of outrage, you have to actually do the work of mass communication. And that requires, I guess, documentaries and exposés and that kind of thing. So, I don't even know if I have a question here other than how do you think about this? But for me, it's very, very interesting because I rarely see effective altruists doing this kind of base level work to actually try to change society's views on a topic. Normally, they're much more interested in a couple really smart people go do a technical intervention and change something that makes a difference. That seems more like we need to change society, which obviously is a good idea too.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you're absolutely right that EAs often have a bias toward projects that have feedback loops. And I think, there's a lot of good reasons for that. I think people often start out skeptical of the ability of charity to change the world. And one way to defeat that skepticism is to have projects that have really clear feedback loops. And you can say, look, we have handed out these anti-malarial bed nets and we can actually point to the life saved. And I think that's a great way to kind of defeat the sort of skepticism that can border into nihilism, I think, around a lot of charitable interventions. But you're absolutely right that that doesn't mean that only things with feedback loops and that are measurable in the short term are worth doing. And I think documentaries are a great counterexample. Both in terms of building greater concern today about factory farming, but also this broader project of enlarging our moral circle, not just for the sake of animals today, but also for the sake of future beings who we may not be inclined to give moral concern to. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to that. And, then the challenge, of course, is how you choose the documentaries that are going to have the greatest impact. And it can be hard to know in advance. But I certainly think that's important work.
Yeah, I almost just think, I do think that effective altruists miss this sometimes. And it's something I think about because I'm in politics and I'm in the business of building a movement around a particular ideology. And this is an ideological podcast. We are who we are. And so obviously this is something I think about all the time. But I almost think, in some ways, if you went back to the 1840s or something and there was the abolitionist movement and effective altruists were transported into that, they would get lost in debates about well, we should spend all of our money doing this technical intervention on this one slave state and changing a regulation there rather than just screaming about abolition all the time, which seems like the morally correct thing to do is to just be a full-scale abolitionist and just write a bunch of pamphlets. I think that's what you did in the 1840s. I don't really know. Is a pamphlet equivalent to a documentary? Who knows? But that seems to me to be something that is almost just missing from the consideration. Ultimately, if you want to change policy, you have to change society so that it's ready to change the policy.
Yeah, look, I think it's a great point that there is well, first, I think a distinction between doing what's most effective and potentially just doing what morally feels like an imperative. And sometimes just yelling about how terrible things are, may feel like a moral imperative. I would challenge, though, the analogy on the abolition movement, because I do think that if you look particularly at the British abolition movement, which achieved an end to slavery in a way that the American movement only did through the Civil War, they really was the split where there were people who just wanted to yell and were absolutely right to do so. There were others who were much more strategic and were much more focused on what are the steps needed to pass legislative reform. And I do think that perhaps the good sort of balance between EA rigor and traditional movement building approaches is to bring that kind of strategizing and looking at what are the pieces needed to pass legislative reform, what are the coalitions you need to build. And I think EAs are increasingly open to and indeed excited about that kind of political change.
I think that's a fair answer. And you get this kind of debate within political circles too. There are people who say want to move the country in the left direction or even in the right direction. I'll make it politically agnostic. There are some people who believe you do that by, moving the Overton window, just shouting about a very, very far left or very far right position and, trying to just change the culture and what's possible. And there are some people who are more coalition builders. It may be the case that both of those are necessary long term, but not to get too bogged down in that point, because we've got just a little bit of time left. And I wanted to throw a couple other questions at you before we get out of here.
Sure.
So one thing that I imagine some people will find coming out of this podcast, some of the listeners are going to say, oh, this is very interesting, but just I would find it repugnant, or maybe they don't say repugnant, but, I can't imagine trying to donate my money to help animals in cases where there is still human suffering in the world. There's still a lot of people who need help, and not in small ways. There's a lot of people who need really, really desperate help. How could I justify donating to animals in that case? What's your reason for working on this, or for this being such an important cause to you? How would you answer that?
Well, I think we can do more than one thing as a society. So I think it's absolutely right that there are really important human priorities in the world today. And I'm very grateful for the people who are donating and working toward alleviating forms of human suffering. I think it's also an important piece of moral progress to alleviate forms of animal suffering. And perhaps the abolition analogy is interesting here. With the early British abolition movement, a lot of the same people who were involved in founding that movement, like Will and Wilberforce, were also involved in founding the movement for the prevention of cruelty to animals. And, if they were, when confronted with such a moral horror, they were capable of also focusing on animal suffering, I think it's possible for us to do so as well. So I think people will come up with different answers to how they want to weigh human suffering versus animal suffering. But I think it's important to recognize that even if you think animal suffering is far less important than human suffering, the sheer scale of that suffering, the numbers, the duration, the intensity, might, and coupled with the neglectedness, with how little philanthropic or government attention is being paid to it, might argue for putting some substantial attention toward the plight of animals.
What do you think is the best criticism of work in this area? And I ask this because I know that effective altruists almost have like a fetish for self-criticism at times. There was recently a contest, for those who are not aware. So I'm actually not sure if it's open philanthropy. We'll just say it's somebody big within the space. I forget who it was, but they had a contest announcing we'll give away like tens of thousands of dollars to the best criticisms of effective altruism that we can find. And inevitably, people put lots and lots of criticisms in. And then there were even meta criticisms that said, we have a criticism of your entire philosophy of accepting criticism. And it's a whole thing in EA. So with that in mind, what do you see as the good criticisms of the animal charity movement?
Yeah, we love our self-criticism. I mean, I think the most obvious one is that it can seem hard to focus on the plight of animals given the plight of humans today and the potential plight of humanity as a whole. And so I think, for instance, two issues that EAs often focus on are the plight of humans in extreme poverty and also protecting the future of humanity against threats like pandemics that could wipe us all out. And so I think it can make a lot of sense to focus on those issues and to think that animals may be less important in the grand scheme of things. I obviously have a different view. I mean, I think that we should care not just about the future of humanity, but the future of animals as well, and the future of all beings. And I do think that in addition to preserving life on Earth, I think it's very important that we continue to expand our moral circle and ensure that the future is not just survives, but is also a good future, and a future in which most sentient beings have lives worth living.
One thing that I've seen, and I think this is kind of out on the fringe, but what is effective altruism, if not interested in exploring the fringes, is the idea of caring about wild animals. That, if there's several billion farmed animals at any given time, well, there's trillions of wild animals, and they count even more, and we shouldn't discount them any less. And my intuition is that most people listening would kind of find that a little bit absurd, but is that something you would agree with, or you would be hesitant about accepting?
Well, I think there are different versions of this, but I think most people would probably accept that we should worry about direct human-caused harm to wild animals, so where humans are trapping or hunting or destroying habitat. I think it's only a small step from there to consider ways in which larger-scale human behavior might have a lot of detrimental effects on the well-being of wild animals. So climate change would be an obvious one. But more broadly, I think a lot of the things that we think of as natural are really human-affected environments. And given humans are affecting environments so actively, I think the most basic thing would just be to start considering animal welfare when we're doing that, and to not solely focus on economic development or biodiversity or other environmental considerations, but also what's best for each of those individual animals.
Fair enough. So we are running up on time now. I'm going to ask the traditional final question that we always ask in this podcast, and that is, what would you recommend for people who want to learn more? And this could be anything that from a book to read to a blog that is very informative, somebody's Twitter that they should follow, a podcast to listen to, although you don't need any podcasts other than this one, guys. This is the only thing you need. But yeah, just anything at all for people who are interested in this topic and learning more about animal welfare and how to effectively do the most good. And it could be your work, it could be somebody else's work. What would you recommend?
Sure. Well, I'd first encourage people to do their own research online. So, don't take my word for it on farm animal conditions. Look up different types of farming. Look up the experiences of different animals and see if it accords with your moral intuitions. Second, for folks who want to hear more of my opinions, I have a semi-regular research newsletter that you can sign up for if you just search for Open Philanthropy Farm Animal Welfare Newsletter. And then finally, I'd recommend on the book front, the novelist Jonathan Safran Foer wrote a beautiful book, Eating Animals, that I think is a great introduction to this issue. I think for those who want to go further, Peter Singer's Animal Liberation is very good, as is a book, somewhat older book by Ruth Harrison called Animal Machines. But, as I say, I think starting out with some online research is a great way to go.
Well, I hope a lot of people do look up some of those resources. I say this as someone who does not plan to stop eating meat entirely, but who is kind of actively reducing how much meat I'm eating, who's been at least partially convinced by these claims. I hope that people go and do that. And I want to say thank you, Lewis, for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Jeremiah.